Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your presence here at our side event. In the conference room D, I'm the head of the Romanian delegation, but here I'm the moderator of this side event organized by four important permanent observers of COPUOS, the Moon Village Association, the Secure World Foundation, the Open Lunar Foundation, and the Hague Institute for Global Justice. Within the last 3 decades and rapid spread of access to information, more of humanity is seeking to attain the security and socioeconomic benefits that space systems can provide. This trend, in turn, is promoting rapid growth in the number of space actors. The growth in stakeholders benefiting from space systems has exposed the limitations of existing global legal, policy, technical, and operational regimes to preserve the space environment. Referring to the moon, exploration and exploitation, the number of governments and private lunar missions multiply every year. New piloted lunar exploration flights are scheduled to begin in 2025, and the implementation in the coming years of permanent lunar bases and cislunar space stations are part of the space programs, as declared by more than one state. Lunar exploration and exploitation will represent a very challenging space activity for the next decades, involving many member states as well as not state actors. The current lack of coordination mechanisms for lunar activities presents a serious challenge to future missions and could lead to conflicts, especially in the light of the increased global interest in specific areas like the lunar South Pole. The need to preserve the peaceful uses of outer space, together with the desire to begin a new era of sustainable space exploration, urges the development of a common level playing field for the upcoming lunar activities. To express their considerations on the above-mentioned topics, we have invited 4 NGOs, as I said in the beginning, to take part at this side event. I'll present them in the sequence outlined in the agenda. The Moon Village Association, MVA, was created in 2017 as a non-governmental organization based in Vienna, Austria here. MVA acts as a permanent global informal forum for stakeholders like governments, industry, academia, and the public, interested in the development of the Moon Village concept. The Moon Village Association fosters cooperation among existing or planned public, private, global moon exploration programs. So on behalf of the Moon Village Association, we have Giuseppe Ribaldi, who is a senior space policy advisor. He's the founder and president of the Moon Village Association, and also the secretary of the Global Expert Group on Sustainable Lunar Activities. He has also acted the executive secretary of the Hague International Space Resources Governance Working Group, which started under his initiatives in 2015. Since 2013, he's the director of human spaceflight and the International Academy of Astronautics. And for 35 years, he worked for the European Space Agency, covering different functions and fields. In particular, he worked 16 years in the International Space Stations program. Okay, Giuseppe is the author of more than 100 publications as well, popular book. He holds degrees in nuclear and airspace engineering as well, international relations. Okay, Giuseppe, I invite you to say a few words as an introduction, and then I will introduce the other speakers.
Okay, so you can hear me because you can see that.
Yeah, I just mentioned, then you inform us that you are sick, yeah, and your voice, it's not the normal one, exactly. But try to do your best.
I do my best. First of all, apology for not being in Vienna, but distinguished delegate, of course, Mr. Moderator, I would like to start with my short presentation. So if I can ask Glavki to go over, I will try to set the scene of this discussion by basically explaining the recommended framework, which has been distributed to all delegations in the last few meetings. So if I can have the next one, please. So basically, you said already, basically the motivation why the Moon Village Association had started this consideration of initiating basically the global expert group on sustainable lunar activity. Just think that in the next 3 months, we will have India launching Chandrayaan-3. We will have Russia in August, Lunar 25, and probably Japan launching SLIM in September. So this obviously there is a need of a coordination mechanism. That is at the root of the GEXLA. So if I can have the next one, please. So the global objective of this organization, which has been, let's say, focused within the Moon Village Association, is to try to bring together in a multi-stakeholder space agency, private company, academia, and international organization, involve, however, also the public, which has been left out for a number of different activity, and act as a platform to exchange information and views. And of course, the important aspect, the platform is there so that everybody participate. And of course, important to support complementary activity within COPUOS. So in February 2023, basically the activity of GEXLA were completed, and the recommended framework key elements for sustainable activity is being published and distributed. I hope also the present COPUOS. So if I can have the next chart, please. So there, basically, next chart, yes. So the membership gives you how global has been the participation. So you can see a number of experts from more than 24 countries and a huge number of observers. So we have tried to reflect in this finding as many pure viewpoints as possible. So if I can have the next one. So basically, the recommended framework is a well-balanced, let's say, document which shows how to implement safe and sustainable lunar activity through norm setting. It is fully complementary to the Artemis Accord. In fact, many of the authors involved in the Artemis Accord were participating. By the way, the large majority of the participants to this event tonight have participated in this GEXLA. So it builds on the principle of international law, as well as an extended principle and the framework to effectively facilitate the dialogue. So it aims to provide transparency, is a living document, and is a very important input to the UN as it has been given. And then the final chart, which will set the scene, basically, what is happening now? Well, I think the recommended framework is a starting of the dialogue. I understand there is a lot of discussion going on the agenda item 14 about how to get moving forward. And of course, we hope that this recommended framework, which will be kept basically alive for the discussion, will be the starting place for the discussion. And this presentation of today's side event is part of it. GEXLA is alive, it will be there, and it will be working in the operational phase. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. So the second organization who is present here through Christopher Johnson is the Secure World Foundation. Secure World Foundation envisions the secure, sustainable, and peaceful uses of outer space, contributing to global stability and benefits on Earth. Its mission is to work with governments, industry, international organizations, and civil society to develop and promote ideas and actions to achieve the secure, sustainable, and peaceful uses of outer space, benefiting Earth and all its peoples. So Christopher Johnson is the space law advisor at the Secure World Foundation and a professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center, where he co-teaches the space law seminar. Mr. Johnson is also a core expert and rule drafter in the Milamos project, a field editor of the Journal of Space Safety Engineering, on the board of editors of the journal Air and Space Law, and serves as the US Board of Directors of the Space Generation Advisory Council. Mr. Johnson has written widely on space law and policy issues and represents the Secure World Foundation at the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for the introduction. This is such an interesting topic. The highlight that I want to point out is, yes, we do have some rules on applicable to lunar activities, but really the future is open. The field is open when we put all those things together and realize that there's a lot more work that is yet to be done in establishing lunar norms, promoting the rule of law on the moon, and promoting peace and sustainability and cooperation on the moon. Very briefly, and this will be remedial for some folks, but it will hopefully be useful for other folks. When we look at the normative environment, the normative context for lunar activities, when you look at the Outer Space Treaty and you go through and see what of it applies to lunar activities, you see that, yes, there are some articles that specifically mention what you can't do on the moon. I'm thinking of Article 4, Paragraph 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which speaks about prohibitions on military bases, installations, and fortifications, prohibitions on weapons testing and military maneuvers on the moon. And yet also on the moon, astronauts shall be regarded as envoys of mankind. And Article 12 speaks of visitation rights on the moon on the basis of reciprocity. And next, we have Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, quite complex set of obligations, which on the one hand are binding obligations. And while they are binding, they are also vague, a bit vague, some of those obligations that states should be bound and to adhere to the principles of cooperation and mutual assistance and pay due regard to the corresponding interests of other actors, and shall avoid harmful contamination of the space domain and adopt appropriate measures to avoid harmful contamination of the space domain. And further obligations in Article 9 talk about, consultations. And, elsewhere in the Outer Space Treaty, we have, on the one hand, a prohibition on national appropriation. Yet in Article 1, we have freedom of exploration and use of the moon. And in fact, that phrase, use of the moon, is in the very title of the treaty. Use of outer space, use of other celestial bodies. And the great freedoms of Article 1 says that the exploration and use of outer space is the province of all humankind. Once we put all of these obligations and freedoms together, it's quite a set of obligations and rights and freedoms that we have on the moon, but it lacks the clarity that we actually will need once we start to actually think through lunar activities and situations and scenarios that may arise on the moon. Let's say that astronauts are on the moon and there's some type of solar flare or cosmic hazard which arises. Which of those obligations in space law would you be relying on if you wanted to, preserve peace and make sure that your astronauts can be saved? What if you're another scenario is like, what if you're looking at a permanently shadowed region or a lunar crater, and you're looking to use it for scientific purposes, and another actor is looking to use it for commercial purposes? Are there any guidelines that we can have, that we already have in space law, that give us some indication, some normative guidance to say this behavior is permitted and this behavior is not permitted? It is, international space lawyers look to what is there, and often it is not satisfying. It's not enough that we need. So with that, this is exactly why we need groups like this and conversations just like this to really start and think through some of the situations that may arise.
Thank you, Chris. Now we have here next to me, on my left side, Dr. Antonino Salmeri. He's representing Opal Lunar Foundation, which is helping to create a peaceful cooperative future on the moon for all life. It works on policy and partnerships that support a sustainable lunar settlement driven by open values. Dr. Salmeri is a space lawyer specialized in the governance of lunar and space research activities. He holds 4 advanced degrees in law and currently works as a director of the Lunar Policy Platform Initiative. This international initiative aims at creating a global, multi-stakeholder, professional, not-for-profit platform facilitating to cooperative development of policies and standards of behavior for safe and sustainable lunar activities. We are grateful also to Dr. Salmeri as an active member of GEXLA for promoting the ideas and topics developed within this global working group in order for the organizations he works with, the final goal being to acknowledge as much as possible, at as much as possible level, the necessity for coordination mechanisms for lunar activities to avoid serious challenges to future missions. Okay, Antonino, you have the floor. Please.
Thank you, Dorian. It's always a pleasure to be together in the same room to talk about lunar activities. Also with Chris, it's being almost repetitive now, but it's good to continue discussing these topics, and I think it will increase further in the future. So it's a great pleasure also seeing many delegates in the room interested in this topic, which in COPUOS is now addressed under space exploration and innovation, and in the legal subcommittee is getting more and more traction also under the space resources exchange and working group. So in addition to what colleagues have been said before, I will underline what we're trying to do with the Lunar Policy Platform, which is first and foremost identify which are the priorities that we need to address in order to enable safe and sustainable lunar activities. We've been hearing a number of issues that Chris mentioned right before, through Article 9, Article 4. I would add, obviously, Article 1 of the Aerospace Treaty on the freedom of use, and how do we reconcile the activities that we want to do on the moon with the fact that there shall be free access to all areas of celestial bodies, and many others that you can find reading basically every provision of the Aerospace Treaty. And so where do we go from here, and how do we start solving these questions? I am a practical person, and I believe in prioritization. This is also the key for true adaptive governance, which should not proceed randomly, but should go in order, priority by priority. So with the platform, we're trying to connect different stakeholders in a way that has never been done before, through asynchronous processes, and by leveraging perspectives, not just from expert individuals, which I think was an excellent contribution from Gexla and the route that led to the recommended framework, but also from organizations. And so trying to understand across the board in the lunar ecosystem what space agencies, governments, companies, civil society, and also some selected expert individuals think about the priorities. And then once we have identified those, work to operationalize our commitment towards safe and sustainable lunar activities for the development of standards of behavior, which I want to underline, it's not necessarily, and I would say not in the framework of the platform for sure, technical standards, but rather expectations of behavior to increase predictability through which we can enable then later on safety and sustainability, but also investments from companies. If today you want to start a lunar business and you go ask for money to an investor, the first question they will ask you is, are you even sure that you have a business? And are we sure that someone else will not run over your business and will ruin it through interference or open conflict? And so things like standards of behavior will provide that minimum level of predictability, reduce mistrust, increase confidence, while bodies like COPUOS work on the initial set of principles that the Working Group on Space Resources is developing, and then further on frameworks like the recommended framework on lunar activities, obviously in complement also with countries are doing. We know that the Artemis Accords are a foundational framework to that end, and then it's going to be probably a framework for the Lunar Research Station from our Chinese colleagues. And so in addition to that, we need to have also coverage at the operational and policy level, and that's what the platform aims to do. And with that, Dorian, I'll return to you and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Antonino. Now, the fourth institution taking part in our panel is the Hague Institute for Global Justice. This is an independent, non-profit organization that aims to shape discourse and bridge gaps between research, policy, and practice on global issues at the critical intersection of peace, security, and justice, registered with the Netherlands Chamber of Commerce. So Ken Hodgkins is the representative of this institution here. He's currently the co-chair of the off-world approach of the Hague Institute for Social Justice. Before retiring in March 2020 from the US government, Ken managed a vast area of civil, commercial, and national security challenges as the overall scope and nature of the space enterprise rapidly evolved. Mr. Hodgkins worked in the National Environment, Satellite and Data Services International Relations Office and the Department of State's Office for Space and Advanced Technology, where he was director from 2007 to 2020. During his tenure in state, he was the United States representative to the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and was a key figure in the development of the US national space policy and directives. So I mentioned that we worked many years together in COPUOS, and we had a very fruitful collaboration in many topics. Ken, you have the floor to say a few things about your organization and your views.
Good. Thank you, Doran. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I wanted to thank the Moon Village Association for inviting us. I see that my video is not on. I don't know whether it's possible to put that on, but so I just wanted to talk briefly about the Institute, but I want to begin by discussing it or raising to your attention a report that that I had the pleasure of co-authoring or co-chairing with China and with Jordan in COPUOS. It's the report was entitled Global Partnership in Space Exploration and Innovation. It's UN document 105/1168, and that was issued in 2018. And that really was the first kind of intergovernmental report on exploration and what we wanted to achieve collectively on a global basis in exploration and innovation. And one of the key elements of that report was the need for discussions with the private sector on the future. Just a second here. I can't. On the future of the space enterprise as it relates to as it relates to exploration. And the basic assumption here is that for us to explore the moon and other celestial bodies, we will need a very significant commercial input to that. And so I see this meeting as being one of the elements of that report, and I just again want to commend the Moon Village Association for sponsoring this event. Now, in my current role with the Hague Institute, we've developed the Washington Compact on Norms of Behavior for Commercial Space Operations. This is a civil society-driven document outlining at a very macro level fundamental principles that are applicable to activities on the moon, Mars, other celestial bodies, as well as in Earth orbit. The compact, the compact embraces all the work that's been done in the past by governments, but now is taking the next step and saying, why doesn't civil society have a greater role in the future space enterprise, and in particular setting what the rules might be in space. The compact is applicable to activities on the moon. We did draw from the Artemis Accords where it was appropriate, and we really welcome the opportunity for us to discuss further what civil society can do to create a transparent, predictable, and interoperable environment for future use of the moon and exploration thereof. If you look at the continuum of space development, all of the sectors in space began as government monopolies: telecommunications, remote sensing, human space flight, launch, and now the moon and exploration is beginning as a government monopoly, if you will. In the past, once governments have either become bored with what they were doing or have run out of money or believe there's commercial opportunities, they've handed it over to the private sector. But in each case, the architecture for conducting these activities, like remote sensing or human spaceflight, were all developed by governments. Now we have the opportunity to mold the architecture for what we do on the moon with a greater input from civil society. If the past remains the same, which is eventually there will be a very, very robust commercial or civil society element to the moon, then why don't we be part of that? When I say we, civil society, be part of that, the development of the architecture. And that's what we're trying to get at with the compact. We have 70 signatories from all regions of the world, from all sectors of the space enterprise, and we're looking for more signatories. It is a self-governing document that can be used by signatories as they see fit. And I guess the final point I would like to make, it was alluded to, that we now have kind of two competing models, one being presented through the Artemis Accords, the other being presented through the International Lunar Research Station Organization, being led by China. So we have two competing models. There has to be some kind of synergy between those. There's going to have to be some sort of interoperability between those. But right now, without that, we're creating a certain level of uncertainty, if you will, for those who want to invest in the moon, who want to engage in large-scale moon operations. And there's going to, at some point, have to be a meeting of the minds on kind of fundamental issues on how we will manage ourselves on the moon. And that's where civil society is going to have to play a greater role. And I see this process of the organizations represented here today having that ability to influence what's being made at the intergovernmental level. So with that, I'll conclude and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ken. So as you see, we're 4 non-governmental organizations. We represent the civil society in a way here, and by being together, we just express our wish to move forward all these aspects of the moon exploration in the new context of a new reality, very high technological, but at the same time very challenging from many, many points of view, not only legal points of view, but technical points of view, interactions, communications, and so on. So now I can be open the discussions tonight. We expect also questions from you, from the participants at this panel, but in the beginning, I will kindly request all speakers to share their perspectives on the potential correlated approach encompassing the interrelated aspects of coordinating mechanisms and managing lunar activities. The aim is to foster international cooperation, promote peaceful endeavors, and ensure sustainable exploration and exploitation of our nearest celestial neighbor, the moon. So, in the order I give you the floor, Giuseppe, you will be the first.
Okay, thank you. So I think the question is also related to what are we going to do from now on, how we do coordinate. So I think it's important, especially for delegation, to realize that we need a mechanism as soon as possible within the frame of the United Nations. And I think there will be several possibilities and several mechanisms, but I understand that some delegations are already presenting a specific way forward. I think it's important, every one of the present organization here in this event have their own activity, but we do have a common, of course, goal, and the common goal is to coordinate the coordination. So basically, this is an important topic, and I think delegation needs to understand the urgency, can indicate that a potential competition between the Artemis and others. But I think that's something which not necessarily is like that, but certainly have to be complementary. Whatever we do on the moon, people needs to be interrelated. I was asked this question from the Chinese television, and I said that there is no competition because each organization does its best. What is important is to bring them together to talk to each other. And so that's what we need. And hopefully this discussion will help to set up the movement, which then member states will have to take the lead to create these coordination mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Yes, it's about the future, but about the near future and about the long future. Chris.
So I'll put out a couple, 2 concepts that I think maybe a bit controversial or will spark debate. You know, when you think about lunar activities and actually, doing things on our nearest celestial body and the history of space exploration, and faced with the reality that space exploration and development is difficult, challenging, possibly fraught with failures which you cannot foresee beforehand. When we think about what we want to do on the moon, there's on the one hand the desire to make something happen, the desire to develop the moon, the desire to, and the wish and the aspiration to see your moon activity succeed. And we've seen moon activities not reach all their goals recently. So just, can we make it happen? Can we do a successful scientific activity? Can we foster commercial activity on the moon? Is it possible? And really this strong desire to just make it happen. Competing against that is, we must think through that what we do sets a precedent. That if we conduct an activity that may be the mission is successful, but it has second order consequences like contaminating an environment or establishing a norm that it's fine to contaminate or fine to disregard the interests of others, we have to think through the fact that whatever you do, other actors, other states, other actors will look at that and say, well, they've done it. And that therefore they kind of admit that it's permissible to do that. And if they can do it, then we can do it as well. We seem to be permitted to do it. And I point that out to say, well, it may be a good business plan, or maybe not a great business plan, to say, do some of these activities and license some of the activities we want to see on the moon. So if your business model is, interring cremated human remains on the moon, or even cremated pet remains on the moon, or doing some type of publicity stunt on the moon, just to see it happen. Other actors, other states will say, well, they've done that. You're setting the bar pretty low. And if actor A permits that type of activity, then obviously actor B can go ahead and do something which is equally, short-sighted, narrow-minded in terms of what they want to do. So on the one hand, the interest to make something succeed. On the other hand, the competing interest and the idea you're setting a precedent for what you're going to do, and other actors will be paying attention to it. I'll put that out there. I think that that hopefully it will spark some thinking and characterizing what we want to do. The other last thing that I'll point out is that it is sometimes asserted that those who go first set the rules. Those who do an activity for the first time set those rules in that activity. I don't know if I agree. That certainly does not exist as a principle of international law, that those who do an activity first therefore set what the rule is. And in fact, we've seen, and we can look across history, where actors have done things which other states did not like that particular activity and then acted to outlaw and prohibit it. So those who go first maybe don't set the rules, but they certainly shine a spotlight on that activity and draw attention to it and get the rest of the global community, which has the competency to create international law, thinking about that activity. So I'll leave it there, but I hope that is, and I think I already see some people who'd like to respond to that.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Antonino?
Thanks, Dorian. It's always fun to follow after Chris in debates and discussions. But I mean, we share many views together, actually. And I want to emphasize one thing, which starts from what Chris said, right? The idea that activities sets precedent, and what is the meaning of that precedent? I think since I'm also here on behalf of the Open Lunar Foundation, this is an organization that has been putting intentionality at the core of our activities, and the same will be in the Lunar Policy Platform. Intentionality means that we're not just doing things, like I said before, randomly, but we sit down and think about the consequences of what we're doing, and now we are making an assessment of whether the goods will outweigh the bads. And I think that level of mindfulness is what we need to achieve if we want to enable safe and sustainable lunar activities, but also legally speaking, if we want to implement the principle of due regard, right, which was mentioned before by Chris, and it essentially requires states, I would say, to being mindful of each other, to being mindful of the fact that there are different activities and that these activities will need to coexist in harmony, because and I couldn't agree more with Chris, there is no such rule, not for sure under international space law, that the first one sets the rules. And for what matters, that first come, first serve approach that sometimes is recalled with reference to the ITU, it's not really the case. It is also a specific norm that has been developed within the context of frequency management, but that does not stem from international space law. For example, when we think about Article 9 of the Aerospace Treaty, we look at the different principles in it. Many refer to the principle of non-harmful interference, but in fact, the Article 9 does not prevent that. Article 9 requests that there shall be international consultation if a state foresees potentially harmful interference. It does not forbid the interference per se. And so it doesn't give the first to be there the right to say, I have the right to enjoy my activity and you cannot do anything about it. Because the article doesn't say that. The article says states should talk to each other and they should find a solution in good faith. That is a true interpretation of the principle of due regard. Now, doing that post facto, after things have happened, after there is already an activity or after millions and billions of dollars have been spent, it's much more difficult exercise. That's why the idea of anticipating what could be the challenges and what could be the overlaps is the exercise we should be doing right now. Is trying to being aware of what's going to be the status of the moon over the next 10 years and then identify where complementarities are and also where the gaps are and where the overlaps and challenges are. But that starts with information sharing. And so in GEXLA, I was the co-chair of the first subgroup on information sharing. And together with my colleague from India, Rajagopalan, we've been leading a very, very insightful group of experts discussing the importance of information sharing for safe and sustainable lunar activities. It all starts there. So I think the first step we need to focus on is how do we share information in a way that is also meaningful for then evaluating what are opportunities for cooperation and what are the risks for conflict, overlaps, and interference, and then use that information to anticipate those and solve them before they happen, ideally, or at least have a process for addressing them in a way that it's not conflictual and remains peaceful. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonino. Ken, what are your views?
Yeah. So I was thinking a little bit based on the earlier interventions. From our perspective, through the compact is generally what we're seeking is certainty. It's not so much predictability. They're different concepts altogether. It's reducing the amount of doubt that one would have in terms of making investments in going to the moon. And so what we're asking governments is to provide kind of certainty on how things will be managed, or certainty that at some point they will be talking to each other in order to come to a common vision on how we'll be managing the operations. When I say manage the operations on the moon, I'm not talking about an organization managing it, but just general basic principles on how we operate on a day-to-day basis or how we operate on a long-term basis. And I think that's vitally important, because again, I come back to that notion that eventually there will be a significant commercial activity on the moon. It might not happen within our lifetimes, but it will happen at some point. And why not be part of that architecture in terms of shaping the activities on the moon? Now, Chris mentioned this, the whole notion of being the first come, first serve. From my standpoint, I don't want to say one of the big problems, but one of the challenges is that, the treaties allow governments or state parties to authorize and provide continuing supervision for the activities of their nationals in space. So a state can go ahead and authorize and then supervise, Chris, when you mentioned a publicity stunt on the moon. Now, whether you think that's a good idea or not, is one question, but the real question is, what is the context that a state is authorizing and supervising an activity for which it's brand new and something entirely new, like putting a hotel on the moon. And what is that context? And how do we have kind of a shared view on, are these good ideas? Are these ideas that kind of resonate in the global community as a good use of private as well as public resources for these kinds of space activities? And that's where I think that organizations represented here are vitally important to begin to shape that view. Now I come back to the report on global partnership in space exploration and innovation. Now, this was done in 2018, so this predates the Artemis Accords, and it was not at that time a foregone conclusion that everybody shared the view that going to the moon was a good idea. And now today we have an agenda item in the committee that in fact is saying it actually does make sense. So that's a huge amount of progress for those of us who are interested in interested in going to other celestial bodies. And the other part of that is the fact that we do recognize that civil society will have a role. So the question will be, how do we carve out a role for civil society in these intergovernmental discussions? Do we leave it simply for individual member states to collect those ideas? Do we have other mechanisms that incorporate the interests of civil society as well as of governments? So I'd just like to throw that out as kind of a general concept that I think would be useful to further develop.
Thank you very much, Ken. Are there any questions to the speakers from the room? Please address them if you have any. No? Silence? Okay, Scott, please, you have the floor.
I would say one of the first challenges, I think, is to know what we are talking about. I think in the long-term sustainability discussions, when talking about what future guidelines and so forth might be, there's been a lot of focus on taking a more step-by-step approach of first saying, like, how are we doing it implementing the current guidelines? What barriers are people having? What are the difficulties are we dealing with in order to establish a foundation of knowledge before we say, here are some additional new guidelines. And frankly, I expect there to be new guidelines, but we also, I think, should go through a deliberate process. And in order to talk about what ought to be set up on the moon and norms of behavior for there, or legally compelling constraints for what people do on the moon, there has to be some way of sharing information more broadly rather than simply getting it from whatever we see on the news or pick up or hear randomly. And so in that regard, I think I agree with the Gegsla point about setting up some sort of information sort of sharing mechanism. And I think we're lucky today, if I look behind me, yes, I've got a bunch of guys from the International Committee on GNSS, which has been part of COPUOS for almost 20 years now. This was set up in early 2000s after coming out of Unispace in 99, I believe. And it has all the GNSS providers. So it's in a room where there's the United States, China, Russia, Europe, India. I've seen Korean representatives or some new applicants from Turkey and Algeria, Pakistan, and it doesn't have any power, despite these really smart guys behind me. What it does is it shares information at the official governmental level, not by space agencies, not by individual advocates or NGOs, but at a governmental level, where then that is then used to make better decisions. Other states can make decisions about what they want to do, maybe a bilateral agreement, maybe do something else in the ITU, maybe take a unilateral action or whatever. But it is a more stable, predictable, and transparent environment, establish a factual basis of what we're doing. So I would say the LTS experience and the ICG experience here argues for creating a a sort of an information mechanism within a multilateral environment to share data. We have things like that in the International Space Exploration Forum, but that's really still at the space agency level. With all due respect to space agencies, there's more involved in things on the moon than simply the space agency efforts. So I think before we get into sort of normative judgments about whether or not cremated remains should be allowed on the moon, I've had that interagency meeting. Let me tell you, it's loads of fun. That we first establish, more clearly what states are actually doing, and with some urgency, because we are getting near to operations, and so better coordinated mechanisms. We have, for example, sorry to go on, we have arrangements for sharing space situational awareness with China about what's going on Mars. We don't have something similar around the moon. We probably ought to. We don't have a clear sense about how we would implement obligations under the 68 rescue and return of astronauts. What are the guard frequencies going to be? We have proposals in the ITU for frequencies for COM and NAV in lunar environment, and hopefully that will be accepted as an agenda item. But again, what's going to be the guard frequencies? What are the protocols? What standards? So there's a lot of very practical things. And so I think that data and everything should inform us first before we get into, as the lawyers would say, lex ferenda, about what the law should be. We should first be talking about what are we actually doing? What are the actual problems we need to be solving, which I think are numerous.
Thank you very much, Scott. Yeah.
Yeah, we can just building on this point, right? I've been working on information sharing over the past 3 years. So I completely agree, like I said before, on the need for institutionalized mechanism for information sharing. And on top of what has been said by Scott already, I would like to point that COPUOS is actually getting more involved in this for good. We do have a provision under the Outer Space Treaty, which is Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty, that says states agree to share information on the nature, conduct, location, and results of their activities. And it's been underutilized, to say the least, over the past 50 years. And now COPUOS has an opportunity to see what we can do with this provision and utilize it, because developing new entities and new institutions, it's always a fun idea, but it will take some time. And in the meantime, of the next 5 years, what do we do? And Article 11 is the answer, and I was pleased to see that the working group on the status and applications of the treaties in the legal subcommittee decided to take upon its mandate for the next 5 years to discuss mechanisms for enhanced and institutionalized information sharing. So I think because we are also in COPUOS, that's the starting point for that. And then we can create those procedures, we can test them, and eventually they could certainly form the basis for further development. I also want to mention that the Open Lunar Foundation is working on the development of a registry for lunar activities. And so at the moment, we have a design committee that is looking at how such registry could be set up in a multi-stakeholder fashion. And so that is also another initiative that could complement, again, a civil society level initiatives and sharing of information in United Nations through COPUOS.
Thank you, Antonino. So was a question on my left side here from Emily. Emily, please.
Thanks. I was actually contemplating whether to allow the hour to go by without a woman speaking, but and I know that people want to go to the Swedish event. My question was more just about timing, but I think Antonino really sort of got out that here, that as lunar exploration missions are sort of getting underway, yes, there's a lot going to be happening in the next 10 years, but a few things at a time, and perhaps allowing states to a chance to figure out how this is all going to work and to test out different protocols and ways of consulting with one another and sharing with one another with those that are planning to go, before we start to figure out what the institutionalization of it looks like. I tend to think that learning from practice and experience can help inform what those institutions look like. So it was more just a question about timing, but I think Antonino really sort of addressed it very well.
Thank you. We rush. I don't know how quick we can do something. Giuseppe, you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I think it's been said earlier, by other people. I think urgency means next year as much as possible because of what has been already described. So I believe in the frame of the COPUOS, there is a process which is going to be discussed tomorrow. I think we are not going to open discussion here. There is a formal meeting there. I think Moni delegation believes that there is an urgency in a matter of a year or so. And I think that's what the discussion is hopefully going to focus on. Since I have the floor, I just want to add, if I may, Doreen, a point, which is the best way to fulfill the implementation of the Artemis Accord is to create a coordination mechanism beyond the Artemis Accord. And so this is exactly how to best achieve the Artemis Accord. That's a consideration that I think I like to bring up, and if other people want to comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that could be one of the conclusions. Scott? Yep.
Well, I mean, think to Emily's point about timing, one of the other aspects of timing is how, even for those countries that are getting ready to go, is what they want to decide among themselves before they go out and talk to other countries. So, for example, the point made about, suppose you're on the South Pole of the Moon and you have a commercial application for a particular location and you have a scientific application, how do you adjudicate that? Now, clearly that can be an international question. I would submit that's also a domestic policy question, and the interagency coordination of that and what we would permit and how that would go through an interagency process to, say, balance U.S. diplomatic, security, economic, and scientific equities in that. In thinking about going forward, if the international side is challenging enough, I think some of what I know Chris has the scars from this mission authorization, discussions. Countries should be, I think are more and more taking a whole of government approach toward thinking about space, but that raises a number of internal institutional, questions about how they're going to do it. Not insurmountable, and I think very sort of doable. But before we get to the international forum, we first have to figure out what do we want to do inside our own house.
Thank you. Yeah.
So very briefly, this question on timing and when you want to draft regulation for an activity that is about to happen or is just beginning to happen, you can certainly look at the history of space lawmaking and see examples where rules were drafted far in advance of them being necessary. Moon agreement, drafted at a time when they could not really imagine what we wanted to do on the moon or what lunar activities would look like, and yet COPUOS raced ahead and drafted something that 30, 40 years later does not match how that activity will shake out. In the US, and so I insulted the moon agreement, I'll say in the US we drafted national space legislation, 2004 Space Launch Amendments Act, regulating commercial spaceflight and tourism and creating categories of space tourists and spaceflight participants, thinking that space tourism was about to happen. And 20 years or 15 years later, we are now saddled with rules that we thought would govern one activity, space tourists going to space on craft that looked like airplane for a few moments. Now that legislation seems to be applicable to people going to orbit for long periods of time on things that look like rockets and in capsules. So we drafted the legislation far in advance of it being really time to draft it. So, that idea of what you're talking about, prioritization of what are real issues in the near term and what are things that are a little bit further off that let's wait to see what the technology looks like.
Yeah, thank you. Right. So the time it's running very fast. We have to close this event. I thank you all, and the conclusion is that we need to share information, to understand each other, to be transparent and predictable. When we are transparent and predictable, the discussions are more easy and sure. And for that, we really need an environment, a specific environment to start all these discussions at a higher level than just space resources or information sharing. And I think an international Committee on Lunar Activities or International Group on Lunar Activities will be the wise way to start discussing and reporting then to COPUOS, because what we decide at the level of the committee and is agreed by consensus by all countries, it's respected by all of them. If we form different groups, separate groups, and we don't match all our interests, interest of the committee, by instance, we don't do too much. And bottom line, I think, so the proposal's already made in February by, I said, by the Romanian delegation to organize such a committee, as having as an example, as Scott said, the ICG, the International Committee on GNSS, could be a good start to discuss and to start understanding the value of this cooperation, international cooperation and understanding. Of course, each country develops in this rhythm path the space technology and goes to the moon. First, 2025, China announced also that in 2030 they could have the first person on the moon. And the cooperation, international cooperation between different parties start to be more efficient and more direct. But we need to talk between these powers, spacefaring nations and others that have interest in not only in putting people on the moon, but exploring the moon, exploiting the moon, or taking part in different programs of the big spacefaring nations. So thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your cooperation. Thank you, Giuseppe, Ken, Chris, and Antonino. Thank you, Scott, also for pointing out a few very important things. Thank you all, and we finish here. So you will find this side event on YouTube starting with tomorrow's date. It was not translated live, but it was recorded by the Moon Village Association. It will be put publicly on our website and on YouTube. Thank you very much.
Thank you.